Absolutely. Right, over to you, Pat. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here, particularly the local old Daltons, which is very nice to see. I'm ably assisted by the fragrant Mrs. Dalton here on the electronics, and so thank you to her for, not only for today, but for her forbearance in the preparation of all of this. She came in the other day and I was sat in front of the computer and she said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "Yes, I'm practicing." And half an hour later I then spoke again. So, if we can look at the next slide, this is what we're talking about, Garton-on-the-Wolds. My interest is because my Dalton ancestors were blacksmiths here. Dalton's in the record from about 1720, calling themselves blacksmiths from about 1770. My direct ancestor left about 1820 probably, but there were Daltons still in Garton being blacksmiths until the end of the 1800s at least. Where is Garton? If we look at the next slide, and I use this thing, which I hope doesn't bring down an aircraft. However, Garton's one of those places that when you look on perhaps a road map, it's one of those places that sits very happily on the spine, so it's difficult to get a copy of it. However, I found this one, and this actually is Railway Lines of the East Riding, which is an interest of mine, but it does give you a clue as to where it is. And here is Garton. We're down here, Hull, Willoughby, Beverley, and then up to Driffield, and Garton is just, it's on the main road between Bridlington, Driffield, and then on to York. Just to give you some sort of statistics in terms of mileage, you're looking at about 15 miles to Bridlington, you're looking at about 25 miles to York, and on the road to York, a couple of places that will get mentioned, a Garraby, which is probably about 13 or 14 miles from Garton, then Stamford Bridge at about 17 miles, another 8 miles into York. Coming south, you're looking down here at about 20 miles, and a place I'll mention quite a few times is Brough, which has no connection with Dalton's but does fit into this little story. So there we are. If we look at the next slide, the Yorkshire Wolds. Garton is sat here, and the Yorkshire Wolds are interesting because they're classed on Google as being rolling chalk uplands, and they stretch from Flamborough Head, which people would probably know as 350-foot high chalk cliffs, nice headland, nice picture postcards, large RSPB reserve. They stretch in an arc that comes down, and in the very dim and distant past, they crossed what is now the Humber. There are Lincolnshire Wolds down here, but over millions of years the Humber has cut its way through, and so they peter out down towards the estuary here. As I said, about 350 feet high here, climbing to about 800 feet above sea level at this point here. Interestingly, the Humber Bridge was built where it was built because its foundations are on the chalk, which is part of this Yorkshire Wold scenario. Google tells me that the Yorkshire Wolds are famous for having upside-down agriculture, in that the farmers grow their crops on the top of the hills and they run their cattle and sheep down in the valleys. I confirmed this yesterday because we came across from Scarborough Pier across to Willoughby, and virtually every field is a grain crop. We saw very little sign of any sheep or cattle because we were on the top of the wolds. The main crop is grain, corns, barleys, or whatever. An interesting feature of the Yorkshire Wolds is the River Derwent here rises about Well, it gets to within about 3 or 4 miles of the sea at Scarborough, but it can't get out into the North Sea, so it has to wend its way through Rydale, all the way around this escarpment, until eventually it can get into the Ouse, down here, ultimately getting into the Humber. And on the River Derwent is Stamford Bridge, which we'll get a mention later on. The dotted line is what would have been the shoreline. Millions of years ago, when the sea was higher or the land was lower, this would have been where the beach was. So if things had stayed the same, it wouldn't be Garton-on-the-Wolds, it would be Garton-on-Sea. But this is where it would have been. You can see that Garton is very nicely placed for protection from the north wind, just tucked in the little elbow here, and from the prevailing westerlies. So a pretty idyllic place for people to live in. If we look at the next slide, we'll actually look at Garton village itself. And we're looking due east here. Up in the top here, you can just see the very outskirts of Driffield Industrial Estate. And this is the main road that runs down here to Garraby and then on to York. Garraby, of course, is the famous hill that David Hockney painted. And I was brought up in York, and Garraby was the place in the winter when it snowed that you persuaded your parents, or somebody's parents, to take you sledging. And for Maureen, wherever she is, this isn't the sledging that involves abusing Australian cricketers. On a sheet of cardboard. So that was a treat in childhood, was a trip to Garraby Hill. Garton, currently about 300 people live there. There are 3 big farms now in Garton. The village website tells me that there have been as many as 13. And as you walk along the street, you can see evidence of where these other farms will have been. Small holdings, crofts if you like, and some farm workers' cottages. The very first time I ever came to Garton, I went to the church, and then I went to the vicarage, which is in these trees here, to ask the vicar if it was possible to have a look at the grave plan. And he said no, because there's just been a robbery, a break-in here at the vicarage, and they took the safe, and in the safe was the grave plan. So I don't know where my ancestors are buried. The forge that we can actually view from the outside is somewhere about here. And this is the forge that the Daltons worked at certainly during the 19th century. The blacksmith tells me that when I said my name was Dalton, he said, "Oh, blacksmith, yes." He said they were here at some point. Tomorrow there is a possibility, and it is only a possibility at the moment, that we can visit this house here. This is a converted barn, and on the back of the front door of this converted barn are hinges made by Dalton blacksmith in about 1820. And Michael and I visited the lady, and she was quite fascinated when 2 chaps knocked at the door and said, "Can we look at your hinges, please?" She took it all in good spirit, and there we are. If we move on to the next slide, this is looking down onto the church at Garton. Here is the main road, swinging around here. To all intents and purposes, Garton is just a one-street village. But in fact, my suspicion is, and I'll use the word probably a lot, but for the first time I'll say, this is probably where the original Garton village was. This is a street called Pump Lane. There's a village pond here, and I think that obviously there's a spring. The spring feeds the village pond. This is where people have lived. I have been told that if you go onto the top of the church and look down, in these fields here, you can see signs of where there was possibly, or there definitely was, habitation prior to it all being cleared and the village moving to more onto the main road. Michael just briefly mentioned about the church and the torches. When I rang the church warden a couple of weeks ago and said, just to remind you, Cliff, that we're coming in a fortnight. Oh, the electricians are coming and the church closes on the 22nd. But he said, I will try and get access for you. There probably won't be any power, so bring torches. So the cry went out to bring torches. He then rang me and said, they're going to try and fix up some power. So he said, it could be all right. So we'll get a look inside the church, because in the church are the famous murals, which were painted in the 19th century. And this is what makes Garton Church something a bit special. It's a Norman church. There's certainly signs of Norman architecture. And it's built, though you can't quite see it from this viewpoint, on a slight promontory. Probably about 150 to 250 feet above sea level, whereas at the back of the village on this side, it climbs to around about 400, 475 feet above sea level. So this, in if you like, ancient times, would have been quite a safe place to see if there was anybody out here who was not particularly friendly. The village website tells me that Garton is an Anglian village. Again, the word probably. So we're looking at 5th, 6th century, which would seem to fit. And that's probably about all I can say about Garton Village. In doing the research, however, ideas started to come into my head about how to fill this space. And one thing I did learn that I didn't know anything about was, if you go down this road here, it goes down towards Kirkburn. It's just a lane out of the village. And I would just say that Garton isn't in any way strategic. There's no river, bridge, castle, there's nothing. It just exists almost on the side of the road. But if you go down here, you come to a feature which runs probably southeast northwest, and it's called Garton Slack. And slack is a dwell in the land, a hollow, and it's probably, from what I've read, a dried up riverbed from prehistoric times. And in Garton Slack, a lot of evidence has been found of burials from Neolithic times through to Iron Age. And for those of you that visit the East Riding or the Museum of the East Riding, perhaps tomorrow, you'll see cabinets full of crockery, of pots found in Garton Slack. And so I started to think, maybe the Angles did arrive here, but somebody had been down here beforehand. And I started to wonder about who they were and how it might all fit together. And I got to thinking about DNA. So the second half of my little chat is a very light-hearted, non-academic in any shape or form look at the DNA of Garton. I'm in the Dalton DNA project, and I understand the first bit about the sample and it goes for analysis. I understand the last bit where you get put into a group. I get lost in the middle. I'm in Group Z, and I'm happily ensconced in Group Z with a guy called Tom Dalton from the USA, and his ancestor left Garton about 1860 to the US. Mine left Garton about 1820 to go about 6 miles. But when, going back a few years with DNA, I was in the same group as HJ, Howard J. Dalton. And we couldn't understand how Yorkshire Daltons were involved with Bedfordshire Daltons. We couldn't work out whether my ancestor had come up from Bedfordshire or one of my Daltons had gone down to live in Bedfordshire. So further analysis of the two DNA, so at that point we were calling each other cousin. Further analysis of our DNA showed that the divergence then became, the convergence, should I say, then became a divergence. So we now call each other ex-cousins. And I'm left in Group Z, just with Tom Dalton in the USA. So I started to wonder, what was the DNA really of Garton? So, with a lot of poetic license and trying to keep it as light and as non-academic as possible, I'm going to try and take you through Garton and DNA from the year 1 AD. So let's imagine that I've just discovered a family tree. Jen and I have just moved, rooting through some old boxes. I come across this family tree that goes back to 1 AD on the back of a long piece of wallpaper. Lots of names, few dates, no detail. So let me try and give you the detail of what has been going on in Garton. I had to give this a title. And if we go to the next slide, and flick it again, we're going to call it Another Language, Another Currency. And you'll see why in a minute. If we go back to 1 AD, the people who were living in this part of the world were called the Parisii tribe. And the Parisii tribe were very interesting. We know two things about the Parisii tribe. One, they were probably named by the Romans, as that's the first time it was actually written down. And the second is that they came from the area around Paris. They came from the Seine Valley. And if you go to France and talk to the French about the Parisii tribe, they will tell you you spelt it wrong, because in France they spell it with 2 I's at the end instead of 1. The Parisii tribe were Celts, really, and they probably came across about 300 BC. And they inhabited just this part of the East Riding. They were very unusual that their domain, if you like, stretched from Bridlington in the north down to the Humber, and then across to probably about Howden, an area only as big as that, which was quite surprising because just over their border, which was out to the northwest, were the Brigantes, who covered much of the remainder of the north of England, and somehow they managed to survive with Big Brother over their shoulder. So another talent they had was the ability to keep their heads down and keep out of trouble. They were just simple farmers, simple agriculture, few animals, mud huts, straw roofs, as you would expect from the kind of Iron Age. This all changed about 70 AD. If we go to the next slide, you'll see why it all changed. Because my knowledge of Roman Britain is from school, like probably everybody else's. The Romans arrived and they advanced north, but when they got to the Humber they stopped. And they sat on the other side of the Humber for about 2 years. Because they had a policy of not necessarily attacking everybody in front of them. They would try and persuade them to become members of the Roman Empire, and if they wouldn't, they would attack them. And so they sat on the south bank of the Humber, consolidating, dealing with local tribal scenarios, and watching what was going on with the Brigantes. Parisii were fine, not worried about the Parisii. They were worried more about the Brigantes. The Brigantes were headed by a lady called Cartimandua, and she was married to a chap called Venusius, and they fell out and there was a civil war. And the Romans supported her, but sadly she was on the losing side, or she died, she disappeared, and the husband started to become quite belligerent. And finally, about AD 73, the Romans said, right, we've had it with you, pal. You're building this enormous military compound at a place called Stanwick, or Stanwick, which is what we know now as Scotch Corner, really, up there. We're not having it. So across the river they came, and they marched northwards. Parisii tribe, I think they simply waved them through. There's no evidence that there were any battles. They just said, yeah, that way please. So they came across the Humber, Dalton. The Romans built an encampment, a military encampment. Then they went further north above Pickering and built another one. And then they advanced, and because we know the rest, it's Hadrian's Wall, etc., etc. In terms of the DNA, of course, I try to imagine what the young Parisi Dalton lads would have thought to all of these perhaps tasty Roman slave girls or whatever. However, nature takes its course, and the DNA, Parisi DNA gets added to the, or the other way around, the Roman DNA gets added to the Parisi DNA. So we start to build up a bit of a picture of how our DNA may well develop. The Romans, we know what the Romans did. We all went to school, we all did the Roman history. They were good at a number of things. They built good roads, they had a language, they were good administrators, good farmers, and life was pretty good. And I tried to imagine what it must have been like when the Romans first arrived and said to the Parisi, right guys, we need you to do some jobs. The first thing we want you to do is to open up some quarries and mine some stone for us, because we don't want to live in mud huts like you do. We're going to build stone buildings. So that was the first task. And then they said, when you've done that, we want you to chop some trees down. The Parisi would say, well, you're going to have wooden huts? No, no, no. You're going to make some kilns, because we want you to make roof tiles, which will be a bit extravagant for what had been in use before. And when you've done the roof tiles, we'll give you some drawings for something called underfloor heating. And after that, we want you to build a bathhouse, which must have been very, very strange. I wondered, in a moment of joviality, whether the Roman issuing the orders wasn't called Kevinus Maclaudius. I don't know. One good thing about the Romans, of course, they built a big capital at York. Their military headquarters were where York Minster is. And so there would be work, there would be trade for the people living in all of the area around York. 350 years we had these people. It was all very nice, very safe, occasional incursions by the Scots, but generally speaking, life was fairly reasonable. Occasional incursions by people from across the sea, but nothing too concerning. However, we all know what happened. Once we get to about 400, there's problems in Rome, and a guy called Emperor Honorius wrote to all of the towns in the area and said, we're leaving, you're on your own. And in 410, the Romans left. If we look at the next slide, it becomes then a bit of a grey area. I've called it Anglo-Saxons. For probably about 100 years after the Romans left, there were attempts by the Romano-British to create a stable society. It wasn't too successful, and the first people that appeared were the Angles, which is why Garton is referred to as an Anglian village. The Angles came from somewhere like, and my pronunciation isn't very good, but it looks like Schleswig-Holstein, which sounds like some kind of cattle to me. However, we know it's Europe. It's depending on where the border is. These people were Germans or Danes, and they came across. Now I've mentioned Bruff once or twice, and Bruff comes to the fore now because there were two incursions, is generally thought of the Angles. One was into Bruff, and the reason they chose Bruff was because the Parisi had their capital there. The Romans turned it into an administrative centre for themselves. The Angles invaded into Bruff, and it was because the ground was solid. If you go further east down the Humber, It's low-lying, it's marshy, and the Angles didn't want to land somewhere down towards Spurn Point and have to spend 2 or 3 weeks marching up through all the marsh. So they landed on the hard ground at Brough. They were aiming for York. That was where they wanted to set up their capital. There was another suspected incursion somewhere further north, perhaps around Bridlington or Filey, and they were striking across the top of the Wolds, and they were aiming for the Dales. The guy that came in to Brough was called Aella, A-E-L-L-A. There are a couple of places, as the local Daltons will know, called Ella, Kirk Ella, West Ella. I wonder whether that's the inspiration for that name. So, looking back at the DNA, if you like, the Romano-British Daltons, as they probably were, the young lads would suddenly find there would be new playmates to take out on a Saturday night, and these would be nice-looking Danes, Germans, blondes. So we get another addition in time to our DNA. If we move on then through this period, I'll just hang on. The Angles were the first, there were others who came. But by 876, this was the year that the Danish Vikings conquered York and set up York as their capital. I always understood the Vikings to be Norwegians, but in fact the Danes are also called Vikings as well. So that was one thing that I learned. But if we go to the next slide, we're working on the same idea, another language, another currency, and we've got Vikings. In 876 it was the Danish Vikings who were into this area. They'd conquered York. England, of course, was starting to become one country, one monarch, and the last Viking king, if you like, was expelled from Britain in 954. And then, if you like, we would become genuinely Anglo-Saxons. I used the term before as a kind of way of looping a number of different peoples together. From the DNA point of view, we go back to the young Daltons who were in Garton village, and we've now got some Danish Vikings, we've got some ABBA look-alike, shall we say. So we've got a bit more interest, we've got another layer of DNA. We then come to the Vikings. Now we all know about 1066 and all that, and this is where I did start to have a little bit of fun, because Garton doesn't take centre stage, but let's say it's about 4 rows back in the stalls. The brief history, as we all know, is, but I'll go through it. About 1065, Edward the Confessor, who is king of all England, starts to get a bit on the frail side. There are manoeuvrings as to who's going to take over. You know, the men in grey suits, lobbying, you know how it all works. And people have a chat with William in Normandy, they have a chat with Harold, they have a chat with Tostig, his brother. Harold and Tostig didn't get on. But when Edward finally died, the committee met the next day, had a talk about it, the votes were cast. When they were counted, it was Harold Godwinson. And he became the famous King Harold. He'd fallen out with his brother had been kicked out, and he'd gone to live in Norway with King Harald Hardrada, who was a Viking, fully fledged Norwegian Viking. William of Normandy, of course, was quite upset about it, and plans were laid, a cunning plan you could say, for the disposal of Harold by fair means or foul. And the foul means involved Tostig and Harold Hardrada invading the north of England. And this they did in 1066. They arrived in the Humber with 300 ships, packed with Vikings, all big gingy beards, big horns in the helmets. In they came, 300 shipfuls, and up they went to York. The local population weren't very happy. There was a battle at Fulford, which is on the outskirts of York. The English were defeated, and Tostig and Harold took up residence in York, and the army took up residence in Stamford Bridge, which is from Garton some about 17 miles. I wonder in fact whether they didn't sail some of the ships up the River Derwent up to Stamford Bridge. However, that was the situation. Now Michael mentioned Facebook and other media means a bit earlier, but I wonder whether in fact there wasn't a bit of a mobile phone network going on in 1066. And I think that probably Harold had a phone, and it went one day and there was a message and it said, "Hi bro, I'm here, I am in York and Stamford Bridge. What are you going to do about it?" And that was Tostig. Harold wasn't very happy. Up he came with an army, and he surprised the Vikings. The weather was good apparently, according to the records at the time. The army was languishing at Stamford Bridge. All their armour was in their ships, and suddenly somebody said, "Whoa, what's that cloud of dust over there?" And it was Harold. And I have a book here which records the event quite simply. Harold raced up from the south coast where he was on holiday and engaged them in battle at Stamford Bridge. The pitch was in perfect condition and Harold beat the visitors easily. When I was a schoolboy in York, we were regaled by stories of the Battle of Stamford Bridge, of a very large Viking, described as large, massive, enormous, huge, I seem to remember, who held a bridge across the river. And he killed every English soldier who tried to get across, until somebody came up with a cunning plan, another cunning plan, of floating down the river in a half a barrel with a large spear, and he got him from underneath. Very un-British, but that was apparently. The day was lost to the Vikings, and Harold was victorious. Statistically, they only needed 24 ships to get back. The slaughter was that great of the Vikings because their armour wasn't available to them. I wonder whether people in Garton didn't actually go down and see the ships coming up, or perhaps the ships going down, or maybe they even went and watched the battle, I don't know. But they were the statistics, and my warped sense of humour made me wonder whether, in fact, if there'd been eBay at the time, can you imagine what the next free listing weekend would have been like? For sale, Viking longship, used only once, buy a collect, 276 available. So there we are. The mobile phone went again, Harold's mobile phone, and this time it was a message from his own people that said something along the lines of, "Trouble back home, boss. William's come across from Normandy with his army, and they're all on single tickets." It's referred to in the book here, while he was in the changing room, word came that William, Duke of Normandy, had arrived uninvited at Pevensey. We know the rest of the story, don't we? The forced march, 4 days, back down to the south coast, the battle, and Harold was killed. And that's interesting, again, my warped sense of humour. A poem was written at the time, apparently, and it started, "I shot an arrow into the sky, it came to rest in Harold's eye." Apparently people think that Harold was killed by an arrow in the eye. The truth is not quite as pleasant as that, and I can tell you because you haven't had your lunch. He was cornered by William and his troops, or 3 or 4 of his knights, and he was killed. And to make sure he was completely dead, they cut him into pieces. When the battle was over, the tradition was that the fallen warrior his body would be presented back to his mother. William didn't want to do that. Harold's mother even offered to pay, and his weight in gold, but William still didn't want to play ball. And I wonder whether it's because, rather than it being a body, it was a collection of bits. I'll read you what was said on Google again. Another source says that Harold's widow, Edith Swanisha, was called to identify the body, which she did by some private mark known only to herself. So there we are. That's the end of Saxon Britain, and we're then, if we look at the next slide, we're then into another language, another currency. We become Norman French. William's style of operation was that he would supplant the local lord of the manor with one of his own and some troops. Didn't have to do too much of that in the north, as most of the lords of the manor, if they hadn't been killed at the Battle of Fulford, may well have been killed at Stamford Bridge. So we got, in this area we would get a Norman baron and some troops. And again, from the DNA point of view, after a while, the young lads in the family, perhaps some nice French girls to chat to on a Saturday night, and nature takes its course and another layer of DNA arrives. In fact, it wasn't quite as nice as that. William didn't take kindly to the north. The peasants up here revolted a couple of times, and finally he lost his putty, if you like, and sent his army up here and said, devastate the lot. The harrying of the north, it's referred to in the history books. And they came up, and if they couldn't kill whatever was there, they would burn it or knock it down. As I've said, Garton isn't strategic, and also the Yorkshire Wolds, they're rolling chalk uplands. They're not user-friendly if you want to hide. It's not like perhaps the North York Moors or the Lake District. It would be difficult to get away from Norman troops. They were on horses and you would probably be running. However, the chronicler that said that there wasn't a person left living between York and the sea is generally accepted to have exaggerated somewhat. But it took quite a while for the north of England to recover from that devastation. I know in Pickering had a value of about £30 a year prior to the harrying of the north. It was down to, after William had gone, £1 something. It was severe devastation. But the area recovered, and life went on. We would have continued in Garton to have lived in very much the same way as we'd done for the previous 1,000 years. Simple farming, simple agriculture, and it would have continued like that up almost until current times. We weren't involved in this part of the world, particularly in the shenanigans that took place in the Middle Ages. We briefly touched yesterday on Hull and Charles I. The nearest battle in the Civil War, of course, was at Marston Moor, which is west of York. So we were shielded a lot over here from Wars of the Roses and etc. So there we are. When then Norman French, and we become English in the way that we know we are today. My own family, there is an extra layer of DNA, and this will apply to many families in the Hull area. We were blacksmiths in Garton in about turn of the 1800s. My ancestor left about 1820. He worked as an ag lab around villages in the East Riding. His son went to live in Scarborough. His son came to Hull and was a policeman. And he met a lady whose father was German. And he was a seaman, was the German. And he'd obviously, in his sailing, he met a lady from Dover, married her, They had some family in Germany and then some family in Hull. He got a job as a customs house officer in Hull. And when I looked in the Hull censuses, and my two colleagues over here will bear this out, latter half of the 19th century, a lot of people in Hull are Europeans. They're immigrants. They're tradesmen. They're cabinet makers, joiners, tailors, whitesmiths, and they're all from Germany, Latvia, Baltic, these kind of areas. Obviously come in because I think in the case of my ancestor probably latter half of the 19th century in Europe, and it gets pretty hectic, a lot of fighting, a lot of inter-country wars, religious suppression, and Britain. England looks a nice place to be. And so my man settled here, died in the early years, I think about 1910. My great-granddad was a policeman in Hull all of his working life. He had a large family. His two eldest sons became policemen. My granddad was a policeman. But for Grandad, not the bright lights of Hull. He wanted to be back in the country. So his working life was spent in such lively places as Market Wheaton, Escrick, Budworth, Howden, and Withensea, or Witheransea, as people in this part of the world call it, even though it's spelled Withensea. And Grandad settled in Withensea in about the 1920s. His eldest son met a local girl, married her. 2 attempts at children produced my sister and my brother, and the 3rd attempt produced me. We were all born in Withensea, which is a sleepy little place on the east coast, north of Spurn Point, south of Hornsea, and there we are. So 2,000 years of possible, maybe, DNA makes it a bit more kind of believable. So if anybody has any questions, I'll try and fob you off and look with a silly answer.